Well, hello, and welcome back to the Patristica YouTube channel. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Nathan Betz to discuss his a book that's now out, as I've just found out, City of Gods, the New Jerusalem of John's Revelation in Early Christianity. Link down in the description below if you have the £114 spare to purchase it. Nathan is an interesting character because he came to academia a little bit later than many of us, particularly Marcus and Mark and I, who on the channel, who have been doing it almost since the day we were born. But he studied at Oxford and is currently doing a research fellowship at Regensburg. And we met earlier this year in Chicago over breakfast, where we started to discuss his work. And he very kindly sent me over a copy of his book for me to have a look at. And I said immediately, we've got to have you on to discuss this stuff. It's really good. And I think it's quite thought-provoking. And hopefully over the next hour or so, you guys at home will be able to see the sort of conversations that scholars have over breakfast at the conferences. So maybe before we begin going into any detail, I suppose the most important question is, why did you even write this book? What prompted you to start looking at this heavenly Jerusalem, New Jerusalem concept with particular reference to Revelation?
Right. Well, Jack, first, thanks for having me on, and you and your team, Mark and the other Mark. I really appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk about my book with people who are doing fun stuff. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about this stuff with people who are interested. How did I come to this? I mean, I guess I came to academia late, but I did not come to Christianity late. I grew up in a Christian home, and kind of ambient Christian culture in the United States. This idea of heaven is fairly prevalent, and kind of saturates culture, and you get this image of heaven with pearly gates and St. Peter's there with his check boxes and the book of life, and there's angels and there's trumpets and there's your favorite food, and you always play a perfect golf game, and just that. I mean, this is kind of going all over popular culture, but there's this real sense that that heaven has this physical aspect to it, and I was always really curious about it because I was a fairly serious believer, and I always thought like the folk religion of heaven, or this comes from the book of Revelation, the revelation of the New Jerusalem at the end of John's Revelation, and I always just wondered how can you get such a theologically rich image in what became in the Christian canon. And how does it become so, folkified and so freighted with imagery of, a materialistic sense of life and enjoyment, and it really kind of gets debased in a certain sense. It goes from something metaphysical and ontological. And sorry, did you hear that? My iTunes just came on.
We can hear you fine.
Anyway, so when I was finally doing theology properly, like you said, I had a prior career in marketing and advertising and industry, and I came back into academia, and I was actually at the lower reading room in the Bodleian Library at Oxford when I was doing a master's degree there, and I just thought, hey, I wonder what the earliest readings of the New Jerusalem are. I wonder if they kind of match the folk images that people sing about in the blues in the Mississippi Delta, And so I went over and I looked at some of the earliest Greek commentaries on the book of Revelation, and it just kind of blew my mind how kind of rich and complex and layered and nuanced that earliest surviving Greek commentaries were on the New Jerusalem. And I thought, I got to find out more. There's this huge disconnect. Let me go find the book, that talks about all of this. Well, it turns out there's no book. There is no book that traces what may be one of the most culturally powerful images in the New Testament in its early reception. What did Christians think when they heard about the New Jerusalem? What did Christians think about when they read Revelation, when they read those last chapters about the New Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God, prepared and adorned like a wife prepared for her husband? how did early Christians read that? I thought for sure there's got to be a book about this, but there was no book about it. And within a few days, I thought, I think I just found my dissertation topic. And that's exactly what I did. So for the remainder of my time at Oxford, and then I went to go do my PhD at KU Leuven with Johan Leemans and Anthony Dupont. There was just a huge gap in the literature, and I just thought, I'm going to write the book that explains the earliest Christians' perspectives on the New Jerusalem, and kind of write it a little bit as a critique also of the kind of the popular image of heaven, which has kind of come to supplant, which I think is a far more philosophically and theologically rich image that you see in earliest Christian writings. And the rest is history.
Well, I think that's really interesting, because I think that probably one of the most fascinating things about Christianity is that many people who are believers talk about going to heaven constantly, but then when you ask them what it's like, it's ambiguous. And like you say, there's so many different answers you get back. I don't think any amount of God's grace will help me hit par in my round of golf, but nonetheless, that's neither here nor there. So before we get into some details, and as we spoke about before, I have so many deep questions, but it's important to lay the groundwork of sort of where we're going to go with this. So why don't you give us the sort of bigger picture? What is the story of the development of the New Jerusalem? And how have you decided where to begin and end your book? Because I think that one of the hardest things about tracing the development of a particular thought is, well, where's my cut-off point? And lots of people like to say, well, we're going to finish it at Nicaea because that's like an easy ending. But some people say 3rd century, 2nd century, whatever it might be. And I think that's a difficult place. So, yeah, give us that sort of general overview and how you sort of decided the parameters of your research.
Right. Well, I guess when I started, I wanted to kind of look at the entire patristic or authoritative, mainline Christian interpretation of the city throughout the entire early Christian tradition, going up through, I don't know, the 6th century. There was a bunch of commentaries written in the 6th century on the Book of Revelation all over the Roman Empire, North Africa, Spain, Italy, the east coast of the Mediterranean. In Greek and in Latin and in Syriac. It was very rich. But, when you're writing a book, you have time constraints. And so I started to realize that there's actually several stories that are happening with the interpretation of this image. And an important moment for that, aside from the starting moment, where does the image start? We'll come back to that. But until, how far would I go? I eventually decided that Revelation, as a controversial book, really the big controversy surrounding the book starts in the middle of the 3rd century, if not before. Actually, at the beginning of the 3rd century, the controversy begins. But by the beginning of the 4th century, the Greek church, by and large, had really started actively sidelining it, and it was really with the Constantinian turn around 313, when the status of Christians in the Roman Empire changed dramatically and rapidly, that the Greek attitude toward Revelation kind of really crystallized as being an attitude which is highly suspicious of the book. And so I went to that period about to 313, the Constantinian turn, the beginning of Eusebius's career, the end of Lactantius, which kind of demarcates the end of the first big period of kind of universal acceptance of the Book of Revelation. After that, it becomes very fragmented. Different themes start emerging. So I thought, I'm going to just cut it off right here. At the beginning, how did I start, or where do we start with the story? Well, it really depends. Who were the first people to be reading the Book of Revelation? And that's an extremely fraught question. As we began to talk about before our interview, who knows the Book of Revelation? How do they know it? To what extent do they know it? How do they date it? How do they attribute it? It's so the first part of the book, which we'll probably get into, it talks about a number of authors who I think could have been and very well may be interacting with the book of Revelation. I suspect so, but the evidence is not direct. And so what I tried to do in the book is just cover all the possible allusions to Revelation 21 and 22 and its heavenly Jerusalem, and kind of walk through those. And the earliest ones are the most difficult because they're the least certain. As we proceed into the second century, it becomes more certain. I think with Justin certainly knows it. Irenaeus certainly knows it. Melito of Sardis definitely knows it. He's in the 160s. For him, it's already an authoritative text in Asia Minor. I just tried to be encyclopedic in wrapping up all the possible allusions to the Revelation's New Jerusalem, and that's just basically treating them chronologically throughout the book. First in its Greek reception, and then at the end of the Latin reception, which tends to be later, up until 313, more or less. So that kind of covers your second question, which is, how did I work out the dates, and the scope. The first question was, what's the big story here? And that is kind of one of the big surprises from writing this book, because it turns out that kind of that caricature of heaven, or that caricature of the New Jerusalem that I talked about at the beginning of this interview, as being highly materialist. From the very beginning, you get a very materializing view of the heavenly city or the kingdom of God, but you simultaneously get a very allegorical and highly spiritual and highly mystical and metaphysical reading of the New Jerusalem. And these are happening apparently side by side from the very earliest possible readings of the book of Revelation. So on Papias and Justin Martyr, on the one hand, you get what is a fairly physical expectation of a restored city on earth. But then the Shepherd of Hermas, who may be using it, maybe not using it. But then other readers a few decades after that, like in the 160s, Melito of Sardis, they have a highly spiritual reading. So what's fascinating is what you see at the very beginning is the contours of the division and the debate about the book of Revelation, which is ultimately around the millennium and the nature of the heavenly city, whether it's earthly or whether it's something other than or more than earthly. And you see these divisions already within the second century, within authoritative authors. That is, authors that later commentators on the book of Revelation will cite. Papias, Justin, Irenaeus, Origen, Clement of Alexandria. This story of is it a material city on earth, or is it a spiritual reality that we somehow begin to participate in this age and then fully are brought into in the next age? Or is it a blend of both? And I think as we go through this, as I went through the research and as I wrote the book, it became apparent to me that these are really two hermeneutical or interpretive threads that people bring to the New Jerusalem, but then throughout the history, they are completely interwoven. So you get the New Jerusalem representing the deification of human beings, that is, humans becoming gods. That's why I titled this book the way I did, City of Gods. It is a city which is populated by deities who are divine by participating in God himself. And this is pretty universal amongst all of the readings, even the millennialists, even the physicalizers. And so these are the kind of the subplots that are happening in this book as well. The deificational strain, and then there's the millennialistic strain. But the funny thing is even though millennialism does not show up in the spiritualizers, the deification shows up even amongst the millennialists. And so eventually I think what I arrive at is that the fundamental idea of what is the New Jerusalem that John is describing, the fundamental answer to that question is it's a metaphor, it's a poetic way of talking about the closest, most unimaginable union between God and human beings, as represented poetically in a number of ways, but in John's terms, as a heavenly city. And so I think those are some of the key themes and key lines that come out in this book. There's others, but I think that's kind of the big story. That's the big drift that's going on here.
Oh, that's really interesting. And so you mentioned so many figures there, and hopefully we have a chance to go through particularly the 2nd century ones. I think we could be here for 10 hours if we wanted to do all of them. There's a few that I'd like to focus on, and most of them are 2nd century figures. And maybe if we get time, move on to a very famous 3rd century figure on this channel who we like very much, namely Tertullian. Or maybe don't like very much, depending on one's point of view. But I think we should start as we should do at the beginning. So the first person you pick up really in your book is Papias. This strange, enigmatic figure of whom we have no work extant except really what's reported later by Eusebius and a couple of fragments. What's his perception of this New Jerusalem, this heavenly place? And do you think that he is directly drawing from Revelation?
Right. So this is a very complex question. Not long ago, Stephen Carlson, let me just do a book plug here, put out this book. You may have seen this, Jack, or anyone else who's watching. Papias Hierapolis Expositions of Dominical Oracles, put out a few years by OUP, Oxford University Press. He kind of goes through and tries to give a full account of all the things that have been attributed to Papias of Hierapolis. So we know, a lot of what we know from Papias, or think that we know, we actually get from Irenaeus, another one of your figures that you guys like to talk about. So he tells us a few things. He tells him that he knew John, but then the question is, which John? Is it John, the author? Is it the disciple whom the Lord loved? Is it? And I'm going to blank on some of the details now, but the basic thrust is: did Papias know John of Ephesus, John the author of Revelation? Did he know John the Apostle? Who would he have been in touch with? And from Irenaeus, it's not entirely clear. But Irenaeus does associate Papias with a John of Ephesus, and some later writers have associated that with John the author of Revelation, John the Elder versus John the Apostle. And how you read his quotes, and how you read Irenaeus's quotes of Papias, and how you read Irenaeus's identification of Papias will determine whether you think Papias knew or did not know John's revelation. I go with Lightfoot. I think there's some interesting quotes and fragments that seem to connect Papias to a knowledge of the book of Revelation and to John the Apostle directly, or John the writer of Revelation directly. But it's not categorical. It's not a closed case. It is very circumstantial, and the evidence is difficult. I was grilled on this multiple times by various people who are not sure that Papias is actually, alluding to John. But I think that there is a case to be made, and so I try to make the case in this book. And according to that case, Papias, I believe, is reading Revelation more or less in a millennialist strain, in a materialist strain. But at the same time, he indicates that in the New Jerusalem, there's kind of a progress from the Spirit to the Son, and from the Son to the Father. Crucially, that the New Jerusalem is the lowest part of a three-part cosmology, where there's the city, there are the heavens, and then there's paradise, and that there's a kind of a persistent travel from one level to the next in the age to come. So here you have kind of a spiritual reading of the New Jerusalem as well. Irenaeus quotes this. He quotes this fragment, which some, including Lightfoot, attribute to Papias. And if that's the case, then we would have both a very millennialistic reading of John's New Jerusalem on one hand, but also a post-history of the New Jerusalem in eternity, in the future, past this age, in which the New Jerusalem kind of represents this metaphysical reality in which human beings are communing with the Trinity. So even sometimes within the very authors, within a single author, as I think in the case of Papias, you have both the millennialistic strain and the mystical strain occurring in the same author. But yeah, you can hit me with all kinds of questions about Papias and whether or not he did or did not know John and John's revelation. It's very much an open question. I'm taking the positivist, or I'm taking the likelihood view, but I would not fight to the death on that.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked a few times on the channel about Papias and the complexities. I mean, knowing what, where, and when he wrote is, I think, a very difficult question. And so, to some extent, it's almost worth putting him to one side and saying, well, we can come back to that as its own thing. But one of the things that I noticed, particularly in your book, and again, this is particularly pertinent to the people on this channel, and I'm sure we'll actually go probably a bit deeper into this, is that there seems to be a bit of a gap, to my mind, between Papias and then Justin. And in that gap, you only really mention one text, namely the Shepherd of Hermas.
Right.
And just before we then go into what I think that means, or maybe what you think it means, perhaps you could then just give us a little bit about what the Shepherd says about the New Jerusalem, or this heavenly place.
Right. Well, I mean, this is difficult. This is more speculation, and this is what everybody likes to talk about. Whenever I talk with an interviewer or somebody like this, we always end up talking about Papias and the Shepherd. The Shepherd is difficult because it on the one hand, it talks about a stone tower at several occasions at length. I think I'm going to get all the numbering wrong now. But at length, it talks about a stone tower, which is composed of 12 different kinds of precious stones. It's surrounded by angels. It's called the Kingdom of God. Christ is there. It has a ton of the characteristics of the New Jerusalem that occurs in the book of Revelation. If for those following along at home, if you go to page 46 of my book, I kind of give a big table which compares a number of the commonalities between the vision of the stone tower in the Shepherd of Hermas on the one hand, and the New Jerusalem in Revelation on the other hand. It's quadrilateral construction. The structure is great magnitude. The walls surrounding the structure, 12 foundations of the structure, 12 precious stones of various colors and brightness, 12 gates, the location near mountains. Those are all from the tower vision. And those, to me, are so many of those items are so similar to what's going on in John's Revelation. Either the Shepherd is being influenced by John's revelation, or they're potentially both being influenced by a common source. Again, because I'm taking a maximalist view in this book, I kind of go with the proposition and with a suggestion. I think there's a lot of theological reasons for thinking that the Shepherd knows the book of Revelation. I kind of go into detail with with an argument kind of supporting that, drawing on the work of others, and how do you find allusions, how do you source allusions. But I think there's a very good chance that the author of the Shepherd would have either known the book of Revelation directly or would have heard about it. It would have been in the air, so to speak, if manuscripts had not necessarily been transmitted. in Rome early on, I think there was a very good likelihood that the Book of Revelation was already in. There was already a buzz around the Book of Revelation. Certainly, late in that same century, there's a ton of debate about the Book of Revelation in Rome by the 170s. And so by the year 200, there's already treatises being written about it, pro and against, largely around the Montanist question. So, yeah, the Shepherd of Hermas is one of those gap figures who could very well be drawing on the Book of Revelation and the idea of the New Jerusalem. On the other hand, he uses the idea of the bride image, and this is also tied to the kingdom of God. And then there's the image of two cities as well. So I think what we might have here is a bit of a deconstructed New Jerusalem, where the shepherd is taking elements of these visions and separating them out into different elements of his writing. I think this could very well be the case, but again, I think it's open to interpretation. And actually, what I'd really like to see is I'd like to see someone in print, engage with these first two chapters on Papias and the Shepherd, because I think these are really important texts in the reception history of the Book of Revelation. But if I could quickly tack on to that, if I could just kind of carry on with this tiny little lecture, Justin is, when he refers to the Book of Revelation, he's probably writing in around the year 160, and he's referring back to an event which is probably taking place in around the year 135, and he is referring to the apocalypse, the revelation which John saw, and he makes a fairly clear reference to its New Jerusalem. And he even talks about schools of thought about what's the nature of the Jerusalem that we are to expect. So I think this idea of the heavenly Jerusalem, and indeed John's apocalypse, I think it was already current and in the discourse of Christ believers already in the 130s. And then again, Melito of Sardis is writing in the 160s, again in Asia Minor, and he's almost taking for granted that the Book of Revelation is important. He even writes a treatise on it, which has unfortunately been lost, but it's been named by Jerome, it's been named by Eusebius as having been a work that Melito wrote probably in the 160s. So I think there's pretty good, and I have a chapter on Melito in my book as well, kind of reconstructing his New Jerusalem. So to your point, yeah, the early history is sketchy, as it is with almost every topic in second century history, Christian history. It's just so fraught with difficulty and circumstance and missing manuscripts and all this kind of stuff. It gives scholars a lot to write about.
It does. I mean, the last thing we want in scholarship is clarity, because that would
Exactly.
only cause unemployment.
We'd have to stop fighting at that point.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could always try. I mean, we just fight about interpretation rather than and don't talk to me about manuscripts. I'm currently collating all the Ignatius of Antioch manuscripts. It's a nightmare.
All the best.
But I think that what you're saying there is really interesting, and I think that, again, for viewers of this channel, this will be a well-known thing. But someone even put in the comments a second ago, do you, i.e. me, and Marcus appreciate that we're often a minority view in terms of how we view early Christianity? And the answer to that question is yes, we know we're a minority view. But a lot of what you're saying plays into what we talk about, because the dating of the Shepherd and its content and composition is really important in this question, because I, along with my colleagues, think that the Shepherd is a post-Marcionite text, so sort of post-140-ish. And so when you then place it there, it then changes our understanding of the reception of this concept, or any of the other concepts, baptism being a really significant one, I think. And so that leads me then to a really interesting question, and it's one that I immediately had even before I began reading the book, just at the contents, is that among the Apostolic Fathers, or even, dare I say, just any pre-Marcionite text, you don't mention anybody. So
Yeah.
Ignatius is missing, Polycarp, 1 Clement, Barnabas, Diognetus, whatever it might be, are all gone. And so, to what extent do you think that if Revelation is being received as an authoritative text, as you claim in this period, why does nobody else seem to have it? And why is the concept of the New Jerusalem not present?
Okay, so the idea of the heavenly Jerusalem or an eschatological Jerusalem is already present without John. So it's already in the book of Hebrews, which has its own fraught reception history, but it's also in the book of Galatians, Galatians 4:26. It's also in the Testament of Dan. It's in Baruch. It's in a number of ancient Christian, Jewish Christian texts. So this idea of a heavenly Jerusalem is already there. So it's not an idea that I think it's not original to John. It's not original to Revelation. The idea is already a theological topos. It's already a motif, whether or not John was writing about it. And so you're going to see it pop up. My book is specifically looking at the Johannine use of that. So the Johannine use, it's hard to track down. I mean, like I said, but is I've gone and lost my train of thought here. But I mean, the idea is that when it comes to finding allusions in a lot of this early text, it's very hard. It's very hard to do. It's hard to do that with Paul, as you know. It's hard to do that with the Gospels. It's hard to do that with virtually with a lot of things. And I think we also need to, rethink what we mean by authoritative text. I think we have to be really careful to not say canonical text, because I think with the benefit of hindsight of living in 2025, or at any point from late antiquity onward, there's kind of a sense of a generally agreed upon corpus. Maybe it's not complete. Maybe it's fuzzy at the edges, but there's kind of a sense of what's in and what's out. In the 2nd century, I'm not sure that the edges of that corpus were very well defined. And so what could be authoritative for some, like John's Revelation in Rome, perhaps, or in Asia Minor, a lot of the early interpreters of the book of Revelation are coming from or spend time in Asia Minor, which is where the book is to have been addressed in the first place. It may have been authoritative in those places and not in other places. Or it may have had more credibility in some places than others, for some groups of Christians, but not for other groups of Christians, for some people claiming to follow Christ and not others. So I think we have to be careful about talking about early Christianity as being monolithic. And I think you and I probably agree with that entirely. So if you sometimes see John being used, and other time, or if you sometimes seeing John's Revelation kind of being alluded to, and other times you don't see it being alluded to, I think that's the nature of a lot of early Christianity. It's in its first years. Its texts are kind of flying back and forth. It's being transmitted in some ways to some people and in other ways with other people. And it's a while before you have a consolidated corpus of texts, which are kind of universally or at least regionally subscribed to. So I think that's a bit of explanation as to why early allusions to the Revelation and its New Jerusalem seem a bit spotty, is because it's going to be that way for a lot of texts which eventually become recognized as being New Testament canonical. So it's inherent in the project, I think, of reading early 2nd century texts. There's just, who's using what. It's very hard to say.
I wonder whether one of the reasons it's so hard to say actually is rather because the hypothesis, the fringe hypothesis that we hold is the right one, namely that it's hard to say because they don't have them, and that in a post-Marcion New Testament world, these texts start to spring up, not ex nihilo. I'm not saying that at all, but they just start to spring up and become well used. And one of the things that I find particularly striking about even the concept of Jerusalem or the relationship with Jews more generally, is this sort of lack. There's just this. There's no engagement with this in the same way that we would expect in a post-Marcionite world, and I think that has to be recognised. And I think this is always the case, that it's the absences often that we tend to overlook. We focus on all the positive receptions, but not the absences. And again, this is even more so the case with Paul. People are always looking for Paul, but they never look for the absence of Paul. And indeed, I take that one further in that people then never begin to ask the question the other direction. To what extent actually is it possibly the case that some of the New Testament texts are being, even according to traditional dating, are contemporaneous with the writing of these apostolic fathers, maybe even Revelation for that matter? So could it not have been the case that even with traditional dating, that these guys were using the apostolic fathers rather than the apostolic fathers knowing them? And again, then using our model, namely that a lot of these New Testament texts are late 2nd century, well then absolutely that these apostolic fathers and other non-recognised proto-Orthodox texts are influencing the future canon. Again, I appreciate that's probably out of the scope of your book.
No. Yeah, I mean, you're getting way outside, my detailed knowledge here, so my ability to respond, I think, is a little bit stymied. But number one, I think the hypothesis is very interesting. I think this is what scholarship is so good at. Scholarship, when done well, just like the scientific method, is it allows room for a secondary view, for kind of a revisionist reading of what we thought we all understood, by looking at the data from another angle and just asking basic questions all over again and saying, well, what if the variables are different? Like, what if the so-called apostolic corpus, apostolic father corpus came first and a lot of New Testament texts came second? I mean, it's fun to think about. And I think it's things that scholars like you need to think about. I'm more than willing to entertain it as well. But one thing I did want to say is I think we have to be really careful when we deal with 2nd century texts, because based on what we know of the so-called, the library of lost books, the library of missing 2nd century books, if we read Jerome, if we read Eusebius and other early historians, they give these lists of all these books that these early authors apparently wrote, and we just don't have them. Like there's, we don't even have the best of necessarily. Irenaeus wrote a lot, but most of it we don't have. There's a ton of 2nd century authors. We simply have nothing of them left. We know that they wrote, but we know that they wrote. We know what they wrote, but we don't know the contents of what they wrote. And I think it's a little bit. I think Hristo Banev, who is teaching at Durham, I don't know if you know him. I don't know if he's still there. But he made this really interesting comparison that when you're studying early Christianity, it's a lot like you're listening to a badly scratched LP, like a badly scratched record, and it just jumps from one thing to the next, and you kind of have to, how much of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony can you reconstruct from a terribly scratched record? I think that's what we're doing. We're reading the 2nd century or first century and 2nd century Christian record. There's just so much that's missing that it's hard to make conclusive arguments about what they did and what they didn't know, because we have so little of it. But anyway, that's kind of hand waving. That's very meta thinking. But that's kind of something that I had to keep in mind a lot as I was writing, because the early Christian corpus is just so spotty. Yeah. Anyway.
And for our younger viewers, an LP, go and ask your parents. And interesting as well. Yeah, well, interestingly, my mind went to the Sex Pistols. Your mind went to Mozart. Maybe we're very different characters. I do agree with that. And I think that is one of the issues in terms of our understanding of early Christianity being monolithic. And one of the things I find so difficult is that our treatment of the New Testament compared to our treatment of the Apostolic Fathers methodologically is completely different. And it shouldn't be. And part part of that relates to the idea that, everyone says, well, we have this static New Testament, it's really obvious, and that therefore we could just look at the minutiae going word by word through Paul's letters to the Romans rather than looking at the bigger picture. And that's really problematic, actually, and has in some sense plagued us a little bit in terms of pursuing our understanding of early Christianity. And that's why I think the new work that's being done, particularly on what we've previously called heretics, whether it be Marcion or Valentinus or Basilides or the Montanists, whatever it might be, it's really critical to gaining this wider picture of early Christianity. And in particular, their view of one another. I mean, we talk about this all the time on the channel, but even Justin writing, I had some kickback on our last video when I said this, but even Justin writing pros Marcion rather than kata Marcion, right, is significant in the way that he receives him or writes to him, and even says, like, you're in Rome with us. And so, these are big meta questions that do fall outside the remit of specifically your book, but nonetheless are ones that need to be answered. So your book is split into two sections. Three sections. The beginning, and then you have the Greeks and then the Latins. And I'm really interested to know maybe some of the differences you found between the Greeks and the Latins and their treatment of this concept, but also whether it's a difference that you see based on geography or a difference whether you see it chronologically. Does the term evolve / is it based on where you are that changes it? And if I may, we've got a super chat, which hopefully you might be able to use your great professional academic skills to weave this in. This is from Duncan Law, who's a great supporter of the channel. And he asked, is the Jerusalem, and for those of you who aren't Greek speakers, on high, the same as heaven? Is that something that is there from the beginning, or does it grow? And geography. So I've asked you a very difficult question there, but you can use all your mastery of skills, Doctor, to answer the question.
Right. Well, just to deal with the one that was right on the screen now is Jerusalem ano, or Jerusalem above, or Jerusalem from on high. Is it the same as heaven? It really, I think what we really get into the meaning of words here, and not to be pedantic, but when we say Jerusalem above, what do we mean when we use those words? And when we use the word, or when the early Christians used the word heaven, what exactly were they referring to? Were they referring to a cosmological scheme? Were they referring to some kind of place that you can go to somehow? Was it more of a different metaphysical space, kind of like the cosmological idea? And I think if you think as heaven as essentially being that space, which is space being metaphor here, but that space, the highest reality, so to speak, which God inhabits, then you could have heaven referring to that space, or you could have the heavenly Jerusalem referring to that, or that space referring to the heavenly Jerusalem. And so you have heaven and the heavenly Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem being coextensive in some of the writings. Clement of Alexandria definitely links heaven to heavenly Jerusalem. We go to heaven, we also go to the heavenly Jerusalem. He prays at the end of the, I think, I can't remember now, Stromates book 4, or is it the Pedagogus, where he says he prays the Spirit of Christ that he might be winged to his Jerusalem, be carried away by wings to the New Jerusalem. But then again, Clement of Alexandria also says that God that God is heaven, and then he also says that humans become heaven. So this gets back to this whole idea of deification that I was talking about earlier. I think heaven is just shorthand of talking about what it means to exist on a divine level. The New Jerusalem, largely in its absolute sense, I think refers to that as well. It is to be heavenly is to be divine. To be in the New Jerusalem is to be divine in some ways. And so I see Jerusalem above and heaven and New Jerusalem largely as referring to the same reality for most early Christians, certainly from the 3rd century on. but but you asked a question before that, Jack, and I've completely let that go.
In terms of the evolution of the concept, I was wondering because you split the book into Greek and
East,
Latin.
West, Latin, Greek. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, or whether you saw it as
Precisely.
more of a chronological change of understanding.
Yeah. This is I have is my my desktop image. If you could all see it, it's just it's a map of the Roman Empire, which goes all the way from Spain and Portugal in current terms in the west, all the way over to the Parthian Empire and Armenia and everything. So this is the whole space in which this idea is being communicated, this idea of the New Jerusalem. So taking for granted that the record of the book of Revelation originally being written to 7 churches in Asia, and I take that seriously because I think the earliest clear reception of the book of Revelation is taking place in Asia Minor. So it seems like the idea gets its start in Asia Minor. Again, you have Justin, who spends time in Ephesus, who's writing about it. You have Melito, who is in Sardis, one of the apocalyptic churches. You have Irenaeus, who's from Smyrna, another one of these apocalyptic churches. So you have a lot of activity early on in Asia surrounding the interpretation of the Revelation of New Jerusalem. And this is taking place in Greek. I see this kind of spiritual interpretation with New Jerusalem being the destiny of humankind, of becoming divine in some kind of way, as then migrating to Rome at some point. If Hermas is really using it, and if Hermas is writing in a Roman context in the 130s, 140s, or maybe a little bit earlier than that, we know that the idea has already reached Rome and it's being communicated in Greek. And again, in Hermas, you have a very spiritual interpretation, a very non-literal interpretation. On the other hand, you have Papias. He's also writing in Asia Minor, and he has a very materialist, millennialist interpretation. And by millennia is the term I keep throwing around, is the understanding that Christ will come back and set up a physical kingdom in Jerusalem for 1,000 years at the end of time, prior to the final resurrection. So Papias, all of this early activity is actually happening in Asia Minor, and these varying views of the New Jerusalem have all started early, and they've all started in Asia. And they all seem to be spreading out from there, whether to Rome or from Rome to Carthage, to Tertullian, whether from Central Asia, whether Asia Minor to Gaul, in the case of Irenaeus, who is going through Rome. You can kind of see how this idea could conceivably spread from Asia Minor to places like Rome, to places like Gaul, into places like North Africa, so that around the year 200, you have Tertullian talking about John's revelation in the New Jerusalem. You have Clement of Alexandria in Alexandria writing about Revelation in the New Jerusalem. You have the Montanists in Asia Minor, but with significant representation throughout the empire, especially Rome, taking place already in the 160s and 170s. And then you have kind of the homegrown people who are staying in Asia Minor and continuing to write about it, Melito of Sardis, and the like. And then, of course, later you have Origen. So on the one hand, you do have this geographical spread of the idea, but with it, you also have the spread of these two different ideas, of the millennialist idea of the New Jerusalem and of the mystical interpretation of the New Jerusalem. Those seem to simply go everywhere together. A very interesting case is once it makes the leap into Latin. So the earliest author we have who is writing in Latin about John's revelation in the New Jerusalem is Tertullian. And Tertullian, on the one hand, has kind of a classic millennialist view of the city is going to like drop out of heaven, and Christ will be the king, and Christ will reign there. But on the other, in the same book, in Against Marcion, he also is talking about the New Jerusalem as representing the flesh of Christ, and the New Jerusalem as representing the church in her union with Christ. So even in Latin, you get these kind of mystical readings where you have God and man and kind of in juxtaposition in the interpretation of the New Jerusalem. And so in the Latin world, it appears as if the millennialist view, the physicalizing view of the New Jerusalem, seems to be ascendant and seems to be dominating, it seems to be powerful. But it's always accompanied by these mystical strains the entire time. There's another book that's there's the so-called there's a treatise or a sermon probably from the 230s in Carthage called On the Two Mountains, Sinai and Zion. That has a view of the New Jerusalem, which doesn't mention the millennium at all. And it says that the idea of the New Jerusalem descending out of heaven is actually a reference to Christ on the cross, suspended above the earth in the heavens, and the blood and water coming out of his side. And that is the descent of the church from heaven in the blood and water. You have the New Jerusalem dripping out of Christ's side on the cross to the earth, and that's the church. So there you have the New Jerusalem being the church, but already being birthed at the time of Christ's death. So the minute you start to, it seems like every time I wanted to say the Latin West is millennialist and the Greek East is mystical, I'd read a text like that and I realized you cannot generalize. These two strains are constantly interacting with each other everywhere they go, whether it's in Asia Minor, whether it's in Rome, whether it's in Gaul, or whether it's in Northern Africa. These two things just simply run in parallel. And I think that's one of the main reasons why the book of Revelation was eventually kicked out by the East for a while, because what do you do with this kingdom? What do you do with the New Jerusalem? The Montanists are creating havoc within the greater church. Maybe it's best just to get rid of that book for a while, or at least de-emphasize it, or at least classify it differently. So you have Apollonius, writing a book against the book of Revelation in around the year 200. In Rome. But I think a lot of this is stemming out of the ambivalent interpretation of the New Jerusalem that can cut in two different ways. And the church starts to divide over this, and they don't want to divide over it. At least the greater church, kind of the so-called Orthodox church, does not want it to be a point of contention and say the best way to solve the problem is just to get rid of the book. And it seems to have worked to a degree. But anyway, Revelation, it seems, can never be suppressed for long because it comes roaring back again in the East in the 6th century, and then it's present already in Syriac and in Greek, and it's like a beach ball. You just cannot submerge it for long. It will bounce back in your face.
So. I quite like that analogy. If I ever write a Revelation, I'm going to say, quote Nathan Betz, the beach ball of the New Testament. Big thank you to Hard Work, who says thank you for your work.
Nice.
And one of our big fans, Jim, has asked, was the New Jerusalem always thought of coming at the end of time? And I think you've touched a little bit on those things. Is there anything you want to add just to that question?
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. I'm being a bit long-winded here. The New Jerusalem always has an eschatological dimension for all of these authors, as far as I can tell. It's always tied up with kind of the end of history. But I think there's two ways in which ancient Christians are thinking about the end. They're thinking about it in terms of chronological end, like we're all moving toward the end of history, and the New Jerusalem will be kind of there waiting for us, if we've been living a life of virtue and all this kind of stuff. But early Christians also seem to think of the New Jerusalem as being the end in the Aristotelian sense, in the sense of it's kind of like the purpose, or it's the full development or maturity of the Christian life and the church life as we experience it already now. And so, like Hippolytus of Rome, whom we haven't talked about, he says that the New Jerusalem is the sanctified flesh of Christ in the incarnation, with which believers become one when Christ resurrects. You see the New Jerusalem present in the present age already in Tertullian, which I told you about, book 5 of Against Marcion. With Origen, with Clement, the New Jerusalem is always a present reality that a proper Christian or a proper philosopher or a proper Gnostic, depending on which author you're reading, says that reality of the New Jerusalem to come is already now with us in this age and has been since Christ, since the Word of God became incarnate. And so you kind of have this already and not yet thing. The New Jerusalem is not yet, but actually it's in the process of being developed already now, in terms mostly of the progressive revelation, the progressive salvation that we are meant to enjoy during our lifetimes. And so you have this Christological dimension, you have this personal ethical dimension, and you have an ecclesiological dimension, according to which the New Jerusalem is already being experienced by proper Christians already now. And then in the fullness of time, the full reality of the New Jerusalem will be manifested. We will be fully deified, and the city of gods will be amongst the city of men. So is it only eschatological? No. It's also, according to early Christian teaching, it is very much already a present reality into which we are being called to. We're being called to inhabit that already. So there's no straightforward answers. Sorry. It's always a little bit of this and a little bit of that, depending on who you're talking to.
Yeah, which you always need for a second volume, maybe.
I'm working on that.
Well, we'll come back to that. Just one final big question from me before we wrap up. You mentioned the Greeks, you mentioned the Latins. As someone who dabbles in Syriac and really enjoys Syriac literature, are there any other traditions in the East or indeed the West that aren't in the main Greek and Latin traditions that have this focus?
This is a fabulous question. Because of our history, in the educational milieus that we've grown up in, we think of antiquity as being Latin and Greek. But of course, there was an incredibly common language in antiquity, late antiquity, that a vast number of Christians were speaking and writing in a fully literary context. And that's Syriac. This language is alive and kicking in a certain sense, even before Christianity makes the full jump into Latin, I would suggest. Nevertheless, we don't have a lot of it left to us, and perhaps there was not a lot being written in Syriac much before the 4th century. But we do have already in the 6th century, I believe, an anonymous Miaphysite, stridently Miaphysite or Monophysite, depending on the terminology you like to use, commentary on the book of Revelation, entirely in Syriac, and shows great facility with the text, and thinks in very, very nuanced ways about the Apocalypse of John, and underscores its value for Christological for clarification on Christological controversy. So that's already in the 6th century. It's called the Anonymous Miaphysite Syriac Commentary on the Apocalypse. Larson did a big version of it, I think 1984. It has not been revised, but that is fascinating. There's also, I have a paper coming out soon on the invisible reception of the book of Revelation in Syriac. And I kind of talk about some of the ideas in Revelation as being mimetic, meme in the sense of Dawkins' meme, ideas that are so strong that they proliferate themselves through society, eventually without you kind of not knowing where they're coming from. Kind of like dandelion seeds. They end up in your yard and you're not sure how they got there. The ideas from the book of Revelation are so strong that they start showing up in Syriac context. Even when the authors who are writing reject the book of Revelation, they're still using motifs from the book of Revelation. So I'm calling that a kind of an invisible or secondary reception. The idea of the heavenly Jerusalem is a very big part of that. I have an article coming out, and hopefully it'll be coming out very soon, on specifically on the reception of the book of Revelation in Syriac. Coptic is another really interesting area. We know that Revelation was transmitted early into Coptic. What we do have a problem in Coptic, though, is dating the earliest material. So I think before the 6th century, I'm no Copticist, but I've talked to people who are very good Copticists, and they say it's almost certain that Revelation was being used in Coptic circles, but it's in manuscripts that are extraordinarily hard to date with certainty. But nevertheless, Revelation was very common in Alexandria, where it was largely accepted for most of late antiquity, and that is the main. A lot of the intellectual interchange between Coptic speakers and Greek speakers would have been in that context, and so it seems that that would explain why motifs from the Book of Revelation are so prevalent in Coptic literature. Armenian, Georgian is different. It's harder because they appear a little bit later, and they're, the corpora are a little bit more unique. It's there, but I won't be able to speak to that too much. But anyway, even when the Book of Revelation is not being used explicitly in these traditions, I think what's important to remember is a lot of the very visual motifs that are coming from the Book of Revelation, they have a life of their own, and they do get into all of these traditions, and they even get into mosaics and frescoes and all kinds of interesting things inside of churches. So the afterlife of Revelation and its reception is very interesting, but it's often indirect, and the reader or the viewer of heart kind of has to realize that they're looking at a secondary reception very often.
That's really helpful. And lastly, where can we find out about you, and what are you up to? What can we expect to see from you? You mentioned the article. What have you got coming up in the next few months, and where can people find out about all the things that you're up to?
Right. Well, you can just Google me, or I wonder what AI would say about me. But you just Google me. I'm currently at the University of Regensburg. You can see me on LinkedIn. My profile is gradually being updated there. But if you successfully, get to my webpage at the University of Regensburg, which refuses to give me a memorable URL, this is very frustrating. I should get my own domain. But what I'm up to right now is I have a fully funded postdoctoral position at the University of Regensburg in the chair of church history and patrology, or patristics, and I am actually writing part 2 of the history of the New Jerusalem, because when I was collecting all of this material for my first book, I collected so much that I really have material for a second book. And so what I'm writing now is the second book, but instead of being kind of a chronological geographical study of the Book of Revelation and its proliferation throughout late antiquity, I'm going to be looking mainly at the period from 313 on, from the Constantinian turn through the 6th century, and looking at it topically. So the New Jerusalem as the church, as the individual human soul, as a symbol of divine human unity or deification, as the monastery, and as the community of Christian believers. So there's a number of ways that the New Jerusalem is deployed throughout late antiquity, and that is precisely what I'm exploring now and writing about and presenting about. So look up my ORC ID. That's another way to find me, and you can kind of see what I'm up to, what I'm writing, where I'm speaking at conferences, and all kinds of stuff like that. I'll be in Sweden a lot coming up in the next few months. So if you're in the neighborhood, come check me out in Lund.
Magic. Well, I think we'll have to have you on again, basically, after you have done the research for your next installment.
Excellent.
And I'm sure there's more things we can cover. I mean, we didn't even talk about how Stallion even responds to Marcion in terms of the New Jerusalem and what that means. But again, to do that without Marcus and Mark here almost seems like a criminal act. Nathan, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. The hour and 5 minutes has absolutely flown by. And I hope all of you at home have enjoyed the discussion. As always, do go and buy his book if you have the money to spare. I've read about 2/3 of it. It's been gripping and I couldn't recommend it enough. And also remember, please do to subscribe. It's so helpful for the channel. We're almost at 3,000 subs, which is mental to me considering the type of content that we have. Interesting though it is, I appreciate it's not quite as accessible as watching people play Minecraft, but if you can spread the word, it's so helpful. And until next time, have a good one. Bye-bye.